why don't we begin? I'm delighted that Anne Conway was able to draw such a great crowd, not to mention our speakers. And today we're going to have a program on the philosophy of Anne Conway. The speakers are going to be Jonathan Head, Jasper, Reid, and Natalia Strok, in that order. Each speaker is going to speak for about 20 minutes, and we're going to have all of the talks together. And then we'll have about an hour for discussion. If you would like to ask a question, send a note on chat with just maybe a word or two about what it is that you want to ask about, so that we can perhaps organize the discussion a little bit. And if you would like to make a comment on a question that's just been raised, just write the word finger, and I will allow you then to jump the queue. So let's get started, and let me begin with the first speaker, who is Jonathan Head. Jonathan. You need to.
Thank you. Sorry, I was struggling to unmute then. Thanks very much, and thanks so much for organising this. And it's really lovely to be part of this. Right, I'm going to share my presentation, so hopefully you'll be able to see it all. I don't know how long this is going to take me. I'm hoping it might not take me more than it might take me less than 20 minutes. What I would like to talk about is a topic that has received quite a lot of attention recently in the literature on Conway, which is the nature of her monism. And actually, there are sort of two related debates going on. And a quick plug: when I finished my book, which is now out, on Anne Conway's philosophy, one of the things that I realized afterwards was I probably hadn't talked about this as much as I should have done. So this is me sort of trying to make up for a bit of a lack in my book, but the book is still worth reading. So that's the plug over. Here are the key questions I'm going to be discussing. According to the Principia, so of course the Principia is Anne Conway's only published work, or at least the only work published under her name. Is there one creaturely substance or more than one? Another way of putting it really is, does Conway postulate only three substances: God, Christ, and creature with a capital C, or more than three: God, Christ, and creatures, plural? My answer to that is that Conway argues for an infinite number of creaturely substances. So that's what I'm going to be arguing for, that reading of her monism. Now, this is a distinct question from another debate that's going on about is Conway, from another perspective, better understood as a monist or as a trialist? Is Conway a monist in the sense that there is just one type of substance that exists, i.e. spirit? Or is it better to understand Conway as a kind of a trialist? There are three kinds of substance distinguishable by their power of change. In my book, I argue that she is a monist in the first sense, that there is just one type of substance that exists. But I'm not going to be talking about that today. I'm just going to focus on the separate question of her monism with regard to her view of creation. Are there an infinite number of creaturely substances according to Conway, or is there just one? Right, so here are our interpretive options. Okay, so on the one hand, we've got existence monism, which is a view that I think is incorrect, which claims that Conway states that there is just one created substance and all creatures that exist are just modes of that single substance. On the other hand, we've got what I call type monism. So there are many created substances, according to this view, possibly an infinite number, but they all share the same type. They're all creaturely spirits, so they're all brought under that kind of species of, and that's a term that's used in the Cambridge translation, at least. And then there are some middle ground positions, or at least what I've called middle ground positions, that have been proposed recently. So there's the oscillating view, which I'll talk about later on, recently proposed by Jessica Gordon-Roth. And there's the priority monism view, which I must admit at the moment, I'm not sure I fully grasp what's that's supposed to be about fully, but anyway, that is a view. That's from a very recent paper from the Journal of the APA. So I haven't had that much time to engage with it, but that's a view proposed by Emily Thomas, priority monism. Okay, so my argument is going to take two stages, basically. So first stage of my argument is going to be these middle ground positions ultimately collapse into one of the two main options. So they ultimately end up being either existence monism or type monism. And then the second stage of my argument is that of the two main options, type monism is to be preferred as an interpretation of Conway. So why has this debate come about? Well, from the prima facie textual evidence, there are good reasons to go either way, either for existence or type monism. If we just focus on the explicit references to created substance or created substances, the textual evidence is admittedly mixed. And I think that's right in saying, whether you're looking at the English translation or the Latin from which the English translation was taken, I think that the ambiguity is there either way. So so you have things that read quite straightforwardly in favour of existence monism. So we find Conway saying the whole creation is always just one substance entity. But at another point, in favour of type monism, she says motion and action are nothing but modes of created substances. And there are various other passages on either side that can be taken one way or the other. So admittedly, the textual evidence is mixed to start off with. Now, one scholar who has recently defended an existence monist view is John Gray, and he one of the things that he says is that any reference to created substances in the plural does not necessarily mean that there's more than one creaturely substance, as far as Conway is concerned, because we could read created substance as involving both Christ as well as a single substance. So according to Conway's philosophy, there is this mediating principle in the universe between God and creation, a separate substance that permeates all things and does various roles. And this is Christ as a metaphysical principle. So if we take Christ as a created substance in addition to the single substance creature with a capital C, then that could explain why she sometimes talks about creaturely substances, created substances, even though she thinks there is ultimately only one substance creature. And I think, you know, that's a reasonably good argument, but the main problem with that is Conway is clear that Christ is not created. Christ is generated by God rather than made or created. So it's not. That's not. I'm not sure that that argument is very persuasive. I think that it would be a very odd slip for her to have made, to mean Christ and creature with a capital C when referring to substances, plural. So I'm not sure, I don't quite agree with that argument. Okay, so onto the middle ground positions. So we start off with the oscillation view. Now, my response to all of this is going to basically be that we have to look at Conway's other metaphysical commitments to try and decide the matter between existence monism and type monism. You know, this ambiguity might be just an artifact of the complicated textual transmission of the Principia. I'm going to presume that people aren't aware of the publication history of the Principia, which is basically Conway left some notes when she died, which were later edited and translated into Latin, and then those notes were lost, and that Latin version was then translated into an English translation. So we have a very complicated textual transmission, and that might explain why ambiguity, and in order to resolve the ambiguity, we need to look at other metaphysical commitments that she might have. Jessica Gordon-Roth, on the other hand, has a really interesting approach, which is basically sort of claiming that the ambiguity is there on purpose. And in fact, both passages in favor of existence monism and in favor of type monism can be incorporated into a single coherent view. So she claims that Conway wants to oscillate between a view in which there is a proliferation of spiritual substances and just one existing substance in the realm of creation. So basically the idea is, from one perspective, existence monism is true. From another perspective, type monism is true, and as far as Conway is concerned, and so this is why we get this ambiguity in the text. So we can answer this question of how many creaturely substances there are from the perspective of creation or from the imagined perspective of God. From Conway thinks that God is timeless. So from God's timeless perspective, all things will appear as one. So from the divine standpoint, all of creation is one substance, so existence monism is true. And then from the perspective of creation, from our limited perspective, there are multiple created substances. Gordon-Roth says that this reading is not intended as a knockdown, not as a knockdown defeat of either the main options on the table, but just an alternative to the two interpretations currently available. So my objection to this really is I don't quite see why this isn't just existence monism. You know, if we are considering creation from the perspective of God, if we are considering the divine perspective upon a particular metaphysical issue, then surely how things appear to God is going to be the correct view. That seems pretty sort of obvious. Either existence monism is true or not, and if existence monism seems to be true to God, then surely existence monism is true. So doesn't the oscillation view just collapse into existence monism? That's my question, and that was my thought. And also just to build on that a little bit. So a couple more questions on this. Why does Conway talk about how things appear from our perspective without more clearly signaling that this is just something that's maybe not entirely accurate? There's something about, you know, it's maybe an artifact of our limited perspective upon things that you know, I just wonder why she didn't talk about that. And there's also a further difficulty, I think, where, you know, she uses our experience of how the world is in order to inform various metaphysical claims that she makes. And it seems to me that approach is immediately undercut if she believes that there is something about our viewpoint upon the world is fundamentally flawed in this way. So I'm just a little bit, I think that reading raises more questions and concerns than it solves at least as far as I'm concerned. Okay, as a second middle ground position, priority monism. So this, according to this view, the whole cosmos is taken as ontologically fundamental, with the parts of creation viewed as ontologically secondary to the whole. So Thomas says this, priority monism agrees with existence pluralism, what I'm calling type monism, that many things exist. However, priority monism agrees with existence monism that the universe is, in an important sense, one. Okay, so again, I'm sort of wondering, how is this not just type monism? I mean, I agree that, you know, the universe certainly for Conway is, in an important sense, one. It has a shared ground in God. It's all the same kind of spirit. We all have this kind of shared moral destiny. As far as Conway is concerned, she has a doctrine of universal salvation, that everything in creation is eventually saved. Okay, so I agree. Yeah, the universe is certainly one in an important sense for Conway, but that's not really going to be enough for the existence monist. If you agree that many created things exist, then you are a type monist. So again, I think this kind of middle ground just collapses into one of the two main options we already had on the table. In this instance, I think it collapses into a type monist reading. Okay, finally, so onto my actual positive argument. This won't take very long. So here's my argument for type monism, why I think this is the best reading. So my strategy is to look at another claim that Conway makes, which is God would seek to create life as much as possible. So God is all good and wants to spread his goodness as far as he is able, and as part of that, God creates an infinite number of creatures over an infinite time span, as far as Conway is concerned. So Conway says this: his creatures are infinite and created in an infinity of ways, so they cannot be bounded or limited by number or measure. So God does as much as he can. And as long as it's not contradictory, God will do it. And there seems to be no obvious reason why God could not create more than one creaturely substance. There's nothing obviously contradictory about more than one creaturely substance existing, certainly within Conway's other metaphysical commitments. So it seems to me that this claim that God would seek to create as much as possible seems to point quite strongly in favor of the type monist reading. So I think this is a reasonably decisive point in favor of the type monist view, which posits an infinite number of creaturely substances. So that's my argument, really. God has created as many types of things as he could, as far as Conway is concerned. God could create a being that moves towards the good, which is Christ, or God could create a being that can move either towards the good or towards the bad. Those are creatures. So God's made as many types of things as he could. He couldn't make something that only moved towards the bad, because that would be something too ontologically distant from God. So God's done as much as he can to create the types of things that he could create. So why wouldn't he also want to create as many things as he could create, in addition to as many types of things as he could create? So it seems to me that it's more likely that on Conway's view, she would be committed to an infinite number of created substances rather than just one. Okay, so to conclude, hopefully I haven't gone on too long. Here are my main claims. So the prima facie textual evidence is ambiguous between type monism and existence monism. The oscillation view collapses into existence monism. Priority monism collapses into type monism. And ultimately, because of other commitments that Conway has, type monism is to be preferred as a reading of Conway over existence monism. And that was all I had to say.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was perfect timing. Okay, the second speaker is going to be Jasper Reid. Jasper, do you need a screen to show your screen?
No, I'm afraid I just have a few pages of things that I might or might not quote. But yeah, I'm working from paper here.
Okay.
Okay. So I thought I might talk about Conway in relation to Kabbalah and the Lurianic strain of Kabbalah in particular. Isaac Luria was a Kabbalistic teacher around the mid or early to mid 16th century. He himself left no writing, certainly not of any note, but his students wrote down his ideas, which were building on the established Kabbalistic tradition in Jewish thought, but taking it in new directions. And it's pretty clear from reading the principles that Conway knew of this material. We know that from independent sources too, and seems to have made some use of it, but is that that I want to explore. So first of all, it seems that Conway had long been interested in some form of Kabbalah, some kind of mystical, esoteric, traditional wisdom. But the form that she was acquainted with earlier on was a very Christianized version. It wasn't the authentic Jewish stuff. She only came to that later. But as early as 1653, Henry More, her closest friend, wrote his book, published his book, Conjectura Kabbalistica, which was directly inspired by discussions that he himself had had with Conway. He mentions this in a letter that she had looked for an allegory of Adam and Eve, and this has injected such a peremptory purpose in me of interpreting the first 3 chapters of Genesis, the continuous paraphrase, etc., that I cannot, for my life, set myself about anything but this till it be done. So she's interested in this stuff, so is he, as early as 1653 or earlier still. But this is, as I say, all coming from a very Christian perspective. It's only after 1670 that she starts to become acquainted with the Jewish texts themselves, the Lurianic texts. This is when Francis Mercury van Helmont moves into her household at Ragley Hall, and he, and more particularly his German friend, Christian Knorr von Rosenroth, had been dabbling in this stuff for a long while, and this was the period when Knorr von Rosenroth was compiling together the largest collection, and I think probably even now one can still say this, the largest collection ever assembled of Kabbalistic texts, which he translated into Latin and published in 2 enormous volumes, Kabbalah Denia Data in 1677 and 84. Knorr was sharing some advanced manuscript copies of some of these texts with the folks at Ragley, at least by 1672. The earliest mention is in a letter by Henry More to Conway of the 5th of February, 1672, where More mentions a couple of Kabbalistic tables that Knorr had produced. And these were things that Knorr himself had produced to summarize certain Kabbalistic ideas. And they would appear in the published volume in 1677, accompanied by a critical commentary by Henry More himself. And certainly in 1675, we know from a couple of sources that More, at the very least, was reading some of this material. He references in particular a work called Emek Hamelech, The Valley of the King, by Natalia Hertzbacharach. We know that he was reading it in April 1675. We also know that he was reading it at Ragley, because he had an extended stay at maybe 8 months or so he spent with Conway in her home, took some time away from Cambridge. And it was there that he was reading this material and indeed writing some of the texts that he would transmit to Knorr for publication in the 1677 volume of Kabbalah Denia Data. And if he was reading this stuff, one would imagine that she was too. And likewise Van Helmont, and they were all discussing it together. I should say that there's no evidence that I have seen that Conway could read Hebrew. She probably could recognize a few key words, probably knew the alphabet, but I doubt it went much beyond that. I doubt she could just sit down and read a book in Hebrew, and much of this stuff simply wasn't available, even if you wanted or could read it. So she would have been reliant, and indeed, well, maybe not more, but certainly she would have been reliant on Knorr's Latin translations. So in terms of what she could have read, it's pretty much what we find in that 1677 volume. And I say just that first volume because the second one of 1684 postdates her death by 5 years. Maybe she saw advanced copies of some of the texts that would eventually make it into that if she was reading some of the 77 material as early as February 72. Maybe the same is true of the 1684 volume, but it doesn't seem that likely. But in terms of the 1677 volume, a lot of it is coming from Knorr himself, drawing on a wide variety of sources and summarizing it and giving paraphrases and synopses. Quite a lot of it is coming from Henry Moore. It's his own commentaries on the materials that Knorr had been sharing with him. Some of it, again, from Knorr replying to Moore's texts. In terms of the actual Lyrianic texts themselves, there are really two key pieces that are relevant here. One is by Chaim Vital, and it's from his book, The Tree of Life, but only the first book of that larger work. It's the book in the volume in full is, I think, maybe 8 books, I forget, but only the first book was translated. And that was certainly shared with the folks at Conway's home of Ragley, because when it appeared in the book, in the published Kabbalah Deniudata, it was followed by a critical commentary by Moore, and then in turn by a reply by Knorr to Moore. So that's one thing. And then the other, much more substantial text, which constituted the whole of the third of the 3 parts of the first volume of Kabbalah Deniudata. This was Abraham Cohen de Herrera's Gate of Heaven, in an abridged form, but nevertheless, well, it missed out the first 2 of the, I think, 10 books altogether, and it slightly abridged the remaining 8, but you do get most of Herrera's work in the 1677 volume. And this was likely to have a special appeal to these Christian authors, Conway, Moore, Van Helmont for that matter, not just because it was more substantial and more all-encompassing than the other texts they had access to, but because Herrera went to some lengths to demonstrate the affinities between these Lyrianic Jewish ideas and ideas in, for want of a better word, the Western tradition. He's constantly making references to the very authors, be it Plotinus or Hermes Trismegistus, or Ficino, or whoever, that people like Henry Moore and here and there, Conway herself, are mentioning. Anyway, that's the background. That's what we know, that people in Conway's immediate circle, in Conway's own household, were reading. So it's likely that at least some of this she would have been reading too. It was clearly the kind of thing that was going to be of interest to her. So it seems fair to say that the stuff that was available to her, she would at least have had some, she would have had a look at and would have been discussing with her friends. Okay, so I don't want to get too bogged down in well, any of this. I haven't really timed what I have to say here, but I'm going to try to stick to 20 minutes. But let's just go through Conway's book, The Principles of whatever it's called, The Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy, and see what we can discern in terms of possible Kabbalistic influences. Well, I'll go through chapter by chapter. In chapter one as such is only very short, and there's nothing really there that I can see that directly links Conway to the Kabbalists. And when I say chapter one as such, I am excluding the annotations to chapter one, because there things get very overtly Kabbalistical. There we get the notion of Adam Kadmon, who I shall come back to. We get the notion of Tzimtzum, the idea that God recedes to form a circular void within himself, which is a place of dimmed light to facilitate creation. It's a space for God to create things in through Adam Kadmon. But those annotations, I don't think are by Conway. It's not completely clear, as it is clear for some of the others more scattered and briefer annotations that run throughout the book. Those definitely weren't by Conway. Some of what appears in this work, one can't really definitively pin it down one way or the other. It could have been by Conway, but I don't believe it. And if we don't regard the annotations to chapter one, and if we think those probably were a later addition to the text by someone else, who knows who, maybe Van Helmont, maybe Noor van Rosenrot himself, well, then there's not much in chapter one that's particularly Kabbalistical. It's not to say that it contradicts Kabbalistic ideas, it's just that these ideas were by no means unique to the Kabbalists. In chapter two, we do get certain possible allusions to Kabbalistic ideas, but the really striking thing about chapter two, and indeed chapter three, is that Conway is disagreeing with the Kabbalists. And this might, and the same goes incidentally for chapter one itself, this might not be so obvious and might be masked by the fact that throughout, especially these opening chapters of the book, there are lots and lots of annotations that say, well, this is kind of like the Hebrews, the Kabbalists, and citing passages in Kabbalah Deniadata that have a bearing on what Conway is saying. And if you just look at those inserted, interpolated annotations, you might think, well, a lot of this is coming from those Kabbalah Deniadata materials. But as I've said, I don't believe that those annotations are by Conway, not least because several of them cite the second volume from 1684. She was long in her grave by that point. But also, when one actually does follow up the citations that it gives, which I suspect most people don't bother to do, but it is worth it, because when one actually looks up what these cited texts are saying, in many cases, they are saying the very opposite of what she is saying. And this is especially true in chapters 2 and 3. So in chapter 2, she's talking about the infinity of creation, and among other things, the fact that there's always been creation going on through infinite past times. It's essential to God that he should be a creator. And she thinks that this means that God creates from necessity. And so she sets things up by saying, well, suppose someone should say that time is finite. This is in section 2 of chapter 2. And then she also says, or let us suppose with others who think that before this world, there was another invisible world and the visible world came from this. Well, there are various possible people that she could have in mind. I think that might actually be a nod to the Kabbalists, because it was part of their system that this visible world that we find ourselves in was by 3 earlier invisible worlds that all 4 of them proceeded from Adam Kadmon, who in turn proceeded from God himself. So yes, the idea that there are other worlds, invisible worlds before this visible world, that's certainly a Kabbalistic notion. But she insists that the world, or maybe the sequence of worlds, has always existed through infinite past times. When one turns to the Kabbalists themselves, we see, for instance, in Vital, in that first book of the Tree of Life that we know the folks at Ragley were reading, what he says is the emanation of this Adam Kadmon, and most certainly these other lower worlds, had a beginning and an end, a beginning in time for their initial existence and their emanation. It was not possible either to hasten or to delay the creation of this world, because each and every world was created after the world above it, and he goes on. Vital explicitly rejects the notion that there has always been some world or other. Rather, this sequence of emanated or created worlds had a definite beginning in the past. And so likewise, Herrera, he insists on a finite past, and he also rejects Conway's reason for insisting upon an infinite past. So in section 5 of chapter 2, she says, the essential attribute of God is to be the creator. Consequently, God always was a creator and always will be a creator, because otherwise he would change. Well, Herrera says, to be an agent of necessity while possessing infinite active potency seems to imply a contradiction, since possessing it, it would produce everything that it could, including an infinite effect, which is impossible. And he says the deity's free will and consent decide to produce only those effects that its most hidden counsel deems suitable to issue from it and actually exist, and they are limited in duration or time that did not always exist, at least in the past that went before. And this discussion in Conway carries on into chapter 3, and she insists that God does not have liberty and indifference. He does not act from an arbitrary will, but from necessity. In section 2, she says, thus it is clear that this indifference of will has no place in God, because it would be an imperfection. For this reason, God is both a most free agent and a most necessary one, so that he must do whatever he does to and for his creatures, since his infinite wisdom, goodness, and justice are a law to him which cannot be superseded. Well, the annotator, whoever is inserting those little parenthetical and italicized annotations and citations in her book, the annotator cites Herrera from this first volume of Kabbalah Deniadata. But what Herrera says is the infinite first cause does not act by necessity or in accordance with its nature, but rather following the counsel of its understanding and the free choice of its own will and consent. Or again, turning back to this notion that the necessity of God's creative activity entails an infinity of past times, Herrera says, although it is infinite, the first cause did not create infinite effects in the infinite time that it contains unmoving within its eternity. It does not operate by the necessity of its limitless nature, but rather by the free choice of its own free will and consent, by which it produced limited effects in specific times and definite spaces and locations. All right, so enough about the infinite past or free will. In chapters 4 and 5, she moves on to this notion of Adam Kadmon, and she does use that phrase. The idea that there is a perfect first emanation from God. She seems to be alluding to this in chapter 4, where she talks about the distinction between logos ousios and logos prophorikos. She says in section 2 of chapter 4, moreover, Jesus Christ signifies the whole Christ who is God and man. As God, he is called logos ousios, or the essential word of the Father. As man, he is the logos prophorikos, or the word which is uttered and revealed, perfect and substantial image of God's word, which is eternally in God and perpetually united with him, so that it is his vehicle and organ. just like the body in respect to the soul. That phrase logos prophorikos was not new with her. Seems actually logos ousios was new with her. The standard contrast with logos prophorikos is with logos endiathetos. But logos prophorikos was an ancient phrase. You find it in various sources, but perhaps most especially in Philo, whom she goes on to reference by name in chapter 5. And Philo, from the 1st century of the Common Era, I mean, yes, he was a Jewish philosopher, but most people nowadays wouldn't regard him as a Kabbalist. But she did. She seems to have gone along with Henry Moore's notion, and not just Moore, I mean, Noor von Rosenroth, and they all agreed with this, that the Jewish Kabbalah was just the latest, or the Lyrianic version of the Jewish Kabbalah was just the latest version of a tradition of thought that could be traced all the way back to Moses. And this was indeed the source of all human learning, and that there was a divergence between, the one current that went through Pythagoras into Plato and Aristotle and so on, and becomes the basis for, again, for want of a better word, Western philosophy. Well, in parallel with that, but on a slightly divergent course, you go through Philo and into the Zohar, and then later the Lyrianic Kabbalah. But it all has this common source, and she certainly situates Philo of Alexandria, Philo Judaeus, in that lineage. But to come back to this point about logos prophorikos, when she characterizes Christ as man, as Christ, yes, Christ who is God as man he is logos prophorikos. When she says Christ as man, certainly as I read it, I don't think she means the human being, Jesus Christ, who was born in Bethlehem and suffered death on the cross. She is, I think, talking about Adam Kadmon. It just told me the meeting is being recorded. I think I knew that. But then, this is not unique to the Kabbalists. Yes, they use the phrase Adam Kadmon, or first man, that's just what that phrase means. But the notion itself is common to a whole host of currents. For instance, in the Platonic or Neoplatonic tradition, you get the notion of mind with a capital M as the first emanation from the one. In Christianity, even in scripture itself, in the first chapter of the book of Gospel of John, you get the word. The word in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. And then, all things were created through the word, and later on the word was made flesh. This is the same theory, really. In chapter 5, she refers to this same theory. She talks about the Son of God, the firstborn of all creatures, whom we Christians call Jesus Christ. The ancient Kabbalists have written many things about this, namely how the Son of God was created, how his existence in the order of nature preceded all creatures, how everything is blessed and receives holiness in him and through him, whom they call in their writings the celestial Adam, or the first man, Adam Kadmon, the great priest, the husband or betrothed of the church, or as Philo Judaeus called him, the firstborn son of God. A whole bunch of Kabbalistic names for this thing, this firstborn of God. You find actually, incidentally, similar lists in a couple of books by George Keith, for any of you who are interested in George Keith. He says some very similar things. But the point is, as I say, that this is not unique to the Kabbalists. Yes, she uses some Kabbalistic terminology, but she's just referring to a theory that she would have long been familiar with, because this was common currency. This was just part of the outlook that she had in common with Henry Moore and many others. In Herrera, and there's another of these little annotations here, which shows you the right place to go and look in Kabbalah Denya Data. Herrera, Abraham Cohen de Herrera, gives the following list of authorities who he thinks are propounding the same doctrine that the Jewish Kabbalists call, or refer to using this term, Adam Kadmon. And the people he lists are Zoroaster, Hermes Trismegistus, Orpheus, Pythagoras, Plato, Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, Pletho, Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, Maimonides, Joseph Albo, Leo Hebreus, Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Durandus, and Julius Caesar Scaliger. These are the very people that Moore had been discussing for donkey's years. Some of them we know that Conway was engaging with. Some of them we don't know that for a fact, because we just don't know. We don't have enough of her writings to trace everything that she was reading and discussing, but she certainly knew of these figures because her closest friends and the people that she was reading refer in turn to these figures. So yes, we get terminology, but not necessarily theories coming from the Kabbalists. And the same is true. I don't know how long I've gone on. I should probably stop pretty soon, but I'll just throw in a couple more points. The same is true of other elements of Kabbalistic terminology. So for instance, in chapter 7, in section 4, she uses the Hebrew word ruach, which means spirit and also signifies air, she says. Well, this was a nod to the Kabbalist theory that there are 3 levels in the soul. What are they? Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama, and this is the middle one. And then sometimes they'll add on 2 higher ones, Haya and Yechidah. I don't know Hebrew, I've probably mispronounced all these things, but what are you going to do? So she does nod to that. But then, as the Kabbalists themselves are at pains to point out, these 3 levels of the soul, they're really just like the 3 levels or 3 parts of the soul that you find in Plato, or 3 elements, faculties in the soul that you find in Aristotle. So Herrera again says, following Plotinus, we can thus establish that there are 3 men in one. That is the ideal or mental, the rational, and the physical, which is the same as our wise men teach about Neshama, Ruach, and Nefesh. Again, it's not a novel theory. It's the theory that, in fact, that Henry Moore embraces of these 3 levels in the soul. It's just terminology that she's drawing. And finally, in closing, just one more instance of this. In chapter 6, we get into the notion of the pre-existence and transmigration of souls. And there she uses a word which unfortunately doesn't appear in the Cambridge translation, which is an unfortunate translation in many ways. And this is just another instance of that. It's in section 6 of chapter 6. She's talking about the spirit of a horse. And she says, if it dies a second, third, or fourth time, does it always remain a horse even though it becomes continuously better or more excellent? And how often does its spirit return? And it's that final word that's the problem here. In the Latin, it's quod plurie spiritus eius revolvetur, which is translated in the 1692 translation. But if he shall die 2, 3, or 4 times, etc., shall he always remain a horse, though he be still better and more excellent, by how much oftener his spirit revolves. Now that word revolves rather than returns is crucial, because this was the standard term that the Kabbalists were using. The term revolve, revolution, rolling, it is the literal meaning of the Hebrew term Gilgal. In the 1684 volume of Kabbalah Denya Data, One of the texts that Noor translates there is Sefer HaGilgalim by Chaim Vital, which he translates as De Revolutionibus Animarum, on the revolution of souls. Or again in 1684, Van Helmont publishes a book in English, 200 Queries Concerning the Revolution of Human Souls, which incidentally was translated into Latin and included in the same volume that of Opuscula Philosophica, in which Conway's own text first appeared. It's one of the other two Opuscula. So yes, Conway herself, even though the Cambridge translation might conceal this fact, Conway herself is using this terminology of revolution. But the theory was nothing new. The idea that all souls are created not piecemeal over the course of history, with the production of each new body, for instance, a new soul is created, being planted into it. That's the view that she and her friends were getting away from. The idea is that all souls were created in the beginning and created in a state of perfection. And then through the misuse of their free will, they defect from that state, they degrade their own condition, they lose some of their psychic or mental powers, they fall into coarser and coarser bodies, but eventually they might aspire to make their way back up and progress to greater perfection once more. Ancient theory, you find it in the Platonists, you find it in Origen, in the early Christian tradition, you find it in Henry Moore, you find it in some of Conway's own earliest discussions. In 1652, she and Henry Moore have just been discussing Descartes in their correspondence, and then have had a bit of back and forth on Descartes, and she says, enough of Descartes, let's try a new topic. Here are some questions about your poem on the pre-existence of the soul. And she presses Moore in 1652. This is clearly an early interest for her, the pre-existence and transmigration of souls. Also in a book which was anonymous but generally attributed to George Rust, a letter of resolution concerning Origen. And George Rust, I would note, was the Conways' neighbour in their Irish estate. She was, let's not forget, Viscountess Conway and Keele, and she, and especially Lord Conway, but she herself too, spent a lot of time in Ireland, and the local church and the local bishop was George Rust, and they knew George Rust, and he visited and spent time with them. He was another one committed to this view. Van Helmont was committed to this view, Noor was committed to this view. So yes, we get some Kabbalistic terminology of revolution, but again, it's a view that she had already been attracted to long before she became acquainted with this Kabbalistic stuff. So to close, to sum up, Conway did have some acquaintance with Kabbalistic, in particular Lyrianic literature. She did draw on it. She drew at least terminology and maybe found confirmation of what she herself had already suspected. But I don't think we should overstate the influence of the Kabbalists on her thought. A lot of these ideas had already been there with her long before she became acquainted with this literature. And if the presentation of her principles, well, to a degree, it seems to mask that fact by all these constant references to the Kabbalists and to Kabbalah Deniadata, most of which, I don't say all, but most of which are not coming from her. They're being inserted into the text by some unnamed editor. I suspect Noor von Rosenroth, but that's another matter. Anyway, I think I have gone on too long, but there I shall stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jasper. And the last speaker is Natalia Strok.
Well, thank you. I will share my screen. Do you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much to Dan Garber for the encouragement. I'm so glad I'm here, and thank you to Dana and Claudia, because this seminar has been a great companion to me during this pandemic time. Well, I will be starting now. In Conway's philosophy, there are three substances which are all good by nature, as goodness is one of the communicable attributes of God. Here is the quotation. The three different substances differ according to their possibility for change. I quote, therefore, there are three kinds of beings. The first is altogether immutable. The second can only change toward the good, so that which is good by its very nature can become better. The third kind is that which, although it was good by its very nature, is nevertheless able to change for good, from good to good, as well as from good to evil. End of quote. The second substance is the mediator between the first and the third. Christ is the union between God and the celestial humanity. This is something I want to remark. I quote, by the Son of God is understood not only his divinity, but his humanity in eternal union with the divinity. That is, the celestial humanity was united with the divinity before the creation of the world and before his incarnation. End of quote. And another quote. Moreover, Jesus Christ signifies the whole Christ, who is God and man. As God, he is called Logos Ousios, or the essential word of the Father. As man, he is the Logos Prophorikos, or the word which is uttered and revealed, the perfect and substantial image of God's word, which is eternally in God and perpetually united to him, so that it is the vehicle and organ. End of quote. Christ has two aspects, the divine word and its image. The image of the divine word is the celestial humanity. As human being is the image of God, according to the Bible. In Conway thought, the process of creation has an emanative framework, as the Neoplatonic one, in which God emanates his Son, and through him emanates the rest of the creatures. Christ is the middle between these two, mixture of the blue and the red in the diagram, violet. The violet is increasing in color, changing toward good. The red must be seen as changing toward good and evil as well. This diagram has been made by my 9-year-old son, so completely with what I have said. As there is more, Christ as the first created being is a primitive state of creation, I quote. Christ is called the first of all created beings by Paul in the passage cited above, where he describes the relation to Christ to creatures who, in their primitive state, were all like the Son of God, end of quote. In their primitive state, all creatures were like Christ. They only changed to good. Nevertheless, the rest of the creatures will never achieve the substance of Christ, because he will always be the union of God and the creature. But I dare to say the creature will attain that primitive state presented in Christ without the godly aspect, which means to attain the state that changed only to good. The point I want to remark is more visible in the following text concerning the incarnation of Christ. I quote, yet when Christ became flesh and entered his body, which he brought with him from heaven, he took on something of our nature and, consequently, of the nature of everything, because the nature of man contains the nature of all creatures, which is why he is called a microcosm. In assuming flesh and blood, he sanctified nature so that he could sanctify everything, just as it is the property of a ferment to ferment the whole mass. End of quote. Christ chooses to incarnate in a particular nature, our human nature, which is called microcosm, because it contains the nature of all creatures. If the creation can be seen as a mass, Christ worked as a ferment of it by assuming the mode of human nature. As human nature was present in Christ before the incarnation, we can assume that something has happened with the primitive Adam, who needs to be rescued by this second substance. I quote, "The purpose of all his suffering up to his death and burial was to heal, preserve, and restore creatures from corruption and death, which came upon them through the fall, and someday put an end at last to time and raise creatures beyond time to himself." End of quote. Through suffering, Christ healed, preserves, and restored that primitive state of creatures corrupted by the fall. As it is known, the fall is a consequence of the transgression of the human nature. So I want to focus now on that nature. The third class that mutable toward both goodness or evil is one substance. All individuals have the same essence, and they are different only modally. Here there is a quote. And Conway states that there are transmutations in the third substance. But this process of transmutation has fixed rules. One, an individual A cannot mutate into an individual B. Two, there are species separated from one another in a finite way where can be transmutations. Three, transmutations are possible due to the mutual love and vital action that exists in the third substance. And four, the scale of beings has an order, and mutations respect that order. I want to return now to the topic of the fall, where it can be seen an interpretation of human nature, microcosm. She says, I quote, "Moreover, since the human body was made from earth, which, as has been proved, contained various spirits and gave those spirits to all the animals, without doubt the earth gave human being the best and most excellent spirit which it contained. But all these spirits were far inferior to the spirit of human being, which they received from above and not from the earth. The human spirit ought to have dominion over these spirits, which are only terrestrial, so that it might rule over them and raise them to a higher level and indeed to its own proper nature. And this would have been its true increase and multiplication." End of quote. The human spirit ought to have dominion over the terrestrial spirit, as it was of a higher level, but only in order to raise them. We can affirm that it is a duty that human nature has to fulfill. In Conway's explanation of the third substance, there is something tricky, which is her presentation of the general characteristics of this substance, which I sustain are not active in every part of this substance, but present in all, although in a potential way. In general, the tendency of creation is to go toward perfection, increase in spirituality. This can be attained in successive transmutations. I quote, "If anyone asks, what are these more excellent attributes? I reply that they are the following: spirit or life and light, by which I mean the capacity for every kind of feeling, perception or knowledge, even love or power and virtue, joy and fruition, which the noblest creature have or can have, even the vilest and most contemptible. Indeed, dust and sun are capable of all this perfection through various successive transmutations, which, according to the natural order of things, require long periods of time for their consummation. End of quote. This means that everything is capable of those attributes, which also means that dust has not knowledge, but is capable of knowledge through successive transmutations. The third substance tends toward wood as an expression of the divine justice and the vital action in creation. This is how divine justice works in the natural world. But this tendency to good in general has an exception, human nature. Divine justice is expressed as punishment and reward when it works on human nature, the species that can act against its own nature. Conway explains. For it is far worse to be a brute in a spirit than to be a brute in outward form and shape. God has arranged all things as justly and wisely as possible, so that no one living carnally like a beast can enter the kingdom of heaven. End of quote. If a higher spirit lives carnally, it will not enter the kingdom of heaven or will not return to its original and primitive state. God allows mutations through the scale of being in a fixed order. The extremes are more terrestrial and more spiritual. In the middle, the steps or species are separated in a finite way. It is possible to go up or down, but following that order. Thus, quote, thus, the lowest became the higher and the higher as it was in its original nature. The lowest, according to the pattern and order which the divine wisdom has arranged so that one change follow another in a fixed sequence. Hence, A must first be changed into B before it can change into C, and must be changed into C before it can change into D, etc. End of quote. The highest in the scale of being is the original nature, and transmutations are the expression of the divine wisdom, which follow a fixed sequence. She is defined as sin is defined as the disorderly direction of motion and cannot be attributed to God, but to that creature that can choose wrong. A quote, indeed, no one thinks that because I say that the motion of every creature can come from God, that he is or could therefore be the author of or cause of sin. For though the power to move comes from God, yet sin is in no way comes from God, but from the creature which has abused this power and directed it to something other than it should. Thus, sin is ataxia, or a disorderly direction of motion, or the power of moving from its appropriate place or state to another. End of quote. I have presented the text where Conway explained what the human spirit ought to have done, and now again the creature should have done something, and instead of that, it abused the power and committed sin. But the merciful God gives the disorderly spirit the possibility of returning to its original state and attaining the kingdom of heaven. The expression of the remedy has been presented. It was the incarnation of Christ, who has suffered for the whole creation. And indeed, human suffering and pain are the reflect of that suffering. It is the divine remedy, the reason of her assuming it is good. I quote, but if anyone should say that it falls into eternal torment, I answer, if you understand by eternity an infinite of ages which will never end, this is impossible, because all pain and torment stimulates the life or spirit existing in everything which suffers. As we see from constant experience and as reason teaches us, this must necessarily happen because through pain and suffering, whatever grossness or crassness is contracted by the spirit or body is diminished. And so the spirit imprisoned in such grossness or crassness It's self-free and becomes more spiritual and consequently more active and effective through pain. End of quote. It is through pain that the spirit recovers from a terrestrial gross or crass state. And what the spirit gains is spirituality, activity, effectivity, and of course, goodness. Suffering and pain are a long-term remedy, and it is the way in which spirit attains its original state without the possibility of losing it again. I quote, "All this time, every sin will have its own punishment, and every creature will feel pain and adjustment, which will return that creature to the pristine state of goodness in which it was created and from which it can never fall again, because through its great punishment, it has acquired greater perfection and strength. Consequently, from that indifference of will which it once had for good or evil, it rises until it only wishes to be good and is incapable of wishing any evil." End of quote. I affirm that sins are found in the actions of the human spirit, in that particular species that in a way can restrain itself from any necessity in creation. This nature is that which receives punishment, but through pain, that creature will return to the pristine state of goodness and will never fall again. Pain in human beings is a catalyzer for the whole creation because human nature is the one that can regain its original state, that contains the rest of the creature as microcosm, in the limit with the second substance that contains this nature as well, but in difference, united to the divine substance. Through divine justice, every creature will return eventually to the pristine state, which means the original human nature of Adam before original sin and the fall. Through pain, the spiritual aspect of the third substance gains more spirituality in an infinite way. To summarize, although Conway's third substance is only one which has one essence, it is possible to see modal and incremental distinctions in it. There is a hierarchy of being that can be nominally grouped in a species. Everything is bounded by mutual love and sympathy because all is this one substance. This allows the transmutations, which have a fixed order, although they can tend toward better or toward worse. In general, the tendency is toward to better, as there is no limit to goodness but a limit to evil. Vital action is the instrument of the divine justice for the transmutations. In the natural world, we do not know how this divine justice works. What we know it is different in the case of the intelligent being or human spirit. Pain is the remedy for the third substance in order to regain a pristine state, more spiritual and more active. The incarnation of Christ is the example, the assurance, in trying that the intelligent creature accepts the goodness of that pain. Why a remedy? Because there was a fall and there is sin. The third substance is present in the second one as the primate human being, microcosm, who had the possibility of change and abuse of that possibility. That abuse produced the fall, which will be cured by pain. The effect of suffering and pain has an everlasting duration in this restoration. The spirit which chose bad will only choose good in the future, after receiving its painful punishment, which will lead to a reward. In the scale of beings, everything will be an intelligent creature eventually, ascending forever to a better state. Everything will mutate into human nature as the highest one. And that nature will keep ascending, and with it all the other species contained in it toward the second substance, which is always unattainable. human beings are responsible for the entire created world, united by its mutual law. All from one blood. That is the reason why I think, and Conway is not only against wars and social differences, but conscious of an ecological level of importance of respecting every creature, which are tending in a natural and divine way to its one primitive nature in order to gain perfection and more perfection. In this way, I like to think that the hierarchy of beings in Conway thought is not only vertical, but also horizontal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Natalia. And thank you also, Jonathan and Jasper. We already have some questions, but remember, if you would like to raise a question with one of the speakers, please write a brief note on the chat, just a brief indication of what you would like to talk about. And if you would like to contribute to a point that is being made, just write the word finger and you can jump the queue. So the first question is Dennis Tauchi.
I'm afraid I didn't quite follow your suggestion, but wrote something a bit longer. But it's mostly a quotation. So I want to ask to Jonathan. So you set the problem up in such a way that there is prima facie evidence for thinking that there is only one created substance, and there must be prima facie evidence against it too. I found one quotation from chapter 3 of Principles, which seems to be quite clear evidence in favor of against existence monism, where Conway says, this is toward the end of this, it clearly follows that his creatures are infinite and created in an infinity of ways, so that they cannot be bounded or limited by number or measure. So that seems to be quite clear evidence, and then we might have to explain away depending on how things go. But I wanted to ask what the similar prima facie evidence for existence monism was, and then Natalia's talk, she mentioned one which I believe is the kind of thing that I was asking you for. So that one comes from chapter 6, section 4. It's kind of a longer quotation. I don't want to read it here, but what is your suggestion for the prima facie evidence for existence monism? And if what I pulled out from Natalia's talk, is that kind of prima facie evidence?
Thanks for the question. I'm afraid that sometimes I have to just put it down to carelessness of translation, or perhaps in the original notes. At other times, I think that on the face of it, quotations in favor of existence monism that seem to be in favor of existence monism require a bit more of a careful reading. So, for example, at 6.4, she's talking about many individuals being gathered into subordinate species and distinguished from each other modally, but not substantially or essentially. So yeah, I mean, if you read that on the surface, it appears like a very strong hint of existence monism. But then there's the question of, okay, what does she actually mean by gathering creatures into species? Well, she talks about that in 6.3, and it's basically a mental act when you bring creatures under a single idea. So when she's talking in that context about thinking all creatures together as only having modal differences, I would argue that she's actually talking metaphorically as opposed to literally, and I think that reading is confirmed when she talks about the metaphor of that St. Paul uses talking about God making all tribes and troops of creatures from one blood. So basically, to give you a quick answer, I think that, you know, there are ways that I can use, I think, to explain away, from using the context to explain away anything that appears to be quite strongly suggesting existence monism. So that's the way I try and deal with it. If not, then I just say, oh, it's, you know, the text is just ambiguous and it probably just crept in at some point during the translation and editing stage.
May I have one small suggestion concerning this?
Sure.
So you do agree in that respect that principle 6.4 is the kind of prima facie evidence that you have to explain away if you are, you know, pluralist.
Oh, absolutely.
Now,
yeah.
the beginning of that quotation is more of the issue in that case, because it comes with an analogy. Well, God is one substance, Christ is one substance, there are different substances, and similarly, in creatures, there are also a single species in substance or essence. So it's because of that analogy that would be more of the issue for a pluralist to explain away. So it's the beginning of that quotation is also important, is what I was trying to say.
Yeah, no, I absolutely see yeah, what you're saying. So yeah, so Christ is one unique thing, God is one unique thing. So likewise, creation is one unique thing, and that would certainly be a natural way of reading that. But again, I would have to say again, you know, she's talking about things in the abstract as a species of things. So there's a species of things that are God, and that's just got one being in it. There's a species of things that are Christ, and it's got one being in it. And then there's one species of creature that's got an infinite number of things in it. So that would be how I would read it. That might strike you as a strange reading, but yeah, that I absolutely agree with you. You know, that is definitely prima facie evidence in favour of the existence monist reading.
Okay, I finished. Next question, Daria Drozdova.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. I suppose I just continue the discussion you have with Dennis, because I wrote there that I would read this passage 6.4 like the substance can be substituted by nature. Like we have one nature in God, one nature like in all creatures. So my question is, if we are looking for textual evidences, prima facie evidences, how can we interpret these terms she's using, words, substance, essence, nature, how they are related? So what does it mean, substance, for her in her texts? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I saw that question in the chat box, and I thought absolutely, yeah. That what exactly does Conway mean by substance? Now, in terms of substance and essence, I think I'm right in saying she uses the term substance or essence, the phrase or something like that, substance or essence, 8 times in the Principia. So I don't think that she doesn't seem to sort of strike a distinction between substance and essence. She seems to sort of think they basically mean the same thing. I mean, my understanding I found a footnote that I wrote which just basically I think that you know, my view of Conway's view on substance is that it is a metaphysically basic thing that can support modes, and it has its own kind of moral destiny. So that's my understanding of Conway's reading of substance. But I think, on reflection, given your question, I think that probably needs a little bit more reflection and nuance. You also mentioned nature with a capital N. I'm not quite sure what exactly you mean by that. I was wondering if you could explain that a bit more for me.
just a quick look through the text. I saw that nature appear there. Capital is just from the text I have on my hand.
Oh, right.
So I just suppose maybe this, like she's saying, like something like substance of things. So, and I was thinking maybe something like nature or stuff, like stuff things are made of.
Yeah, so I made quite a last minute decision with my when I was finalizing my book to use the term quiddity, which I know is not in is not, but it just seemed to me to sort of capture something that I was trying to say about Conway's understanding, and maybe something like that is close to what Conway means by a thing's nature. But I knew when I was doing that was probably a bit controversial, but that was that was something that I'm, to be honest, I'm still pondering about the best way to sort of deal with talking about a thing's nature and its essence and substance in this metaphysical system.
Great. Jasper has a finger.
I do.
Your microphone.
Am I
Right.
muted? I think
You're
yes.
fine now.
Okay, good. On that section 4 of chapter 6, I wouldn't be inclined to trust the Cambridge translation of that section. I wouldn't be inclined to trust the Cambridge translation, but in particular, as regards whether the word creature is being used in the singular or the plural. If one looks at the Latin, it seems to jump back and forth. It also incidentally jumps back and forth at random according to whether it's capitalized or not. So the idea of creature with a capital C, that's not supported by the text. But among other things, and the term comes up several times in this passage, but for instance, in this translation, I keep losing my place. It talks about the medium between, where was that? Well, look, I keep finding it and then losing it again in the translation. But in particular, as I see it, what it says at one point is Christ, the Son of God, that middle being between God and creature, where it's creature singular and with a capital C. But then just a few lines below that, it talks about one intermediary between God and creatures plural with a lowercase c. And it's clearly talking about the same thing. So I don't know whether it's indifference or randomness in the text itself or in the translation, but it's been lost. That leaping about between singular and plural is not present in the translation that we have, the English translation of the Latin. The problem may have come in the Latin translation, that's what I was saying. But yeah, I wouldn't read too much into that text because it's so inconsistent within itself. Section 4 of chapter 6. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Bill Eaton.
First of all, thank you for some wonderful papers. And Jonathan, just for what it's worth, I don't know if it helps, but for Descartes, there's no real distinction between a substance and its essence or its attributes. So I don't know if that helps. But my question was more about these objective truths Conway talks about in chapter 6, and she talks about how they're unchangeable. And that's actually the reason why we can know them. And so that just got me wondering, are they part of the divine nature then, since they can't be changed? Or are they creatures that God creates? So what's the ontological status of these objective truths?
Well, thank you. So at that point in the text, she's talking specifically about the fact of what individual creature you are, which is not going to be sort of one of God's sort of eternal truths or ideas or anything like that. She's sort of talking about something that you know, an objective truth about you, the being that you are. So that would be so it's unchanging, because you know it is unchanging. The being that you are is not something that changes. You are just the being that you are. So she's talking about something quite specific there, but she certainly, you know, from an epistemological standpoint, she certainly does seem to think that the fact that the individual that you, the fact that the individual you are doesn't change, that means that you can know in the true sense of knowing that you are, well, you know, who each individual is in creation, which is what allows you to track their moral progress and judge them across different lifetimes and so forth.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That clears it up a lot.
I think I'm going to insert myself into the queue at this point with a question for Natalia. Natalia, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, but I see
Good.
there is another question for Jasper first.
There's what?
No, there is a queue, and you are
I
jumping the
put
queue.
myself into the queue for a moment. And you were talking a great deal about pain and punishment as being
Yes.
the way in which one advances. It's sort of a grim view, but I'm wondering what exactly pain and punishment mean. When you're dealing with human beings, when you're dealing with sentient creatures, it's clear enough that she means real physical pain and real physical punishment. But as you go down the scale of sentience, it becomes less clear. I mean, presumably oysters are creatures of some sort or another. And I suppose one can understand what pain means. I'm not sure I understand really what punishment means. Oysters certainly do have the possibility of raising themselves in the scale of beings toward greater perfection. And I suppose one would say that it is their ambition to eventually become, you know, things of a higher order, horses eventually, and then maybe human beings. How does that, how are we to understand, say, punishment for creatures of that sort?
Well, I think that in that case, there is no punishment. When we talk about the natural world, even the sun and the stone, they follow this divine justice that we don't know how it works. But I don't think they have a punishment as an oyster. But if that oyster was a human being that transmutate into an oyster, well, that's another story. But I think you are not punishing those, those beings in the lowest part of the scale of being, but the human nature or the human spirit. We have a problem here with nature, spirit, substance. Well,
but the oyster might have originally been a human being who
yes, or no.
who went the wrong direction.
Yes, yes. And she, I don't know why, it will go up or down, but we don't know how or why. Eventually, everything is going toward better. Eventually.
Eventually.
Yes.
There are going to be moments in which some things go down first.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll return to the queue now. Michael Jacovides.
Hi, this is for Jasper. I liked your talk, and I guess this is, I mean, so the main claim is less, the principles are less Kabbalistic than you would have thought. It's an allusion from the footnotes, I guess. And then the question is, what's going on with the footnotes? And I think nobody knows, but people think they're by Francis Mercury van Helmont. And I guess I'm just asking you to speculate, like, what do you think he was up to if you think this is sort of, as it were, injected from below and not from the text itself?
I can't prove this, but if I had to lay money on who wrote the notes, it wouldn't actually be Van Helmont. You're quite right that when people have acknowledged, because I think we have to acknowledge they weren't by Conway, and when people have acknowledged that, they've generally put them at Van Helmont's door. I would actually put them at the door of Noor van Rosenrot. And I say that for a number of reasons. There is, well, let's just start with this. A little while ago, I counted up the texts that these notes are actually citing. And there are 8 references to Herrera. There are 8 to Noor. There are 5 to Vital. There are 2 to Van Helmont, and there's 1 to the Kabbalistic commonplaces of the first part of the first volume. But then the Kabbalistic commonplaces were assembled by Noor, and one of those Vital references is in fact a reference to a particular page that is almost entirely constituted by insertions, annotations by Noor. So really, it's Noor who has the most citations to his name, even more than Herrera does when one adds those two. I think there is circumstantial evidence, and I do say only circumstantial evidence, but I think there is at least that Noor did the translation from English, from the English of Conway's notebook to the Latin published edition. I really don't think Van Helmont did that. I mean, Van Helmont just wasn't very good at Latin, if nothing else, and wasn't the type. But Noor was a very prolific translator. He would have had no trouble doing this, and it looks like the kind of thing that he would have been interested in doing. And we know that he did have a hand in translating other parts of the Opuscula Philosophica. So if he was translating it, then it seems reasonable that he should have, as he went along, inserted these notes. And then, of course, it's clear that they were inserted by someone who had a deep grounding in this Kabbalistic literature, and in particular in Kabbalah Denyadata as such, someone who was able to remember where to find specific passages, remember the passages, and be able to find them across the 2,500 pages of it. Well, the person best placed to do that would be the person who compiled it, Noor van Rosenrot, and translated most of the Kabbalistic texts themselves. No one had greater intimacy with the material than he did. So he would be the best place to be making all those references. The comments that appear in these notes, I can't find any that Van Helmont wouldn't have gone along with, but equally there are plenty that fall in line with things that Noor himself was also saying elsewhere. So I think more likely of the two is going to be Noor than Van Helmont, but can I prove it? I cannot prove it. That's my strong suspicion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the next person on the list is Aaron Wells.
Hello, I had a question for Jonathan. So I understood, I guess, the idea that for Conway's God, it's best to create not just as many types of thing as possible, but as many existence, like the largest number of existence possible, that that was clear to me. So I guess my question, though, is why those existents need to be substances specifically rather than something like modes. And part of why I'm worried here, I guess, is a parallel with Spinoza, because Spinoza also has these very strong statements about the plenitude of what God creates or what follows from God, infinite things in infinite ways, he says, and yet, at least as far as substances go, he is a monist. So yeah, I'm wondering whether there might not be a possibility of something similar in Conway where there's an infinite number of something that follows, but it need not be substances.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. I mean, I think for one thing, for one thing, Conway is very worried about looking like a Spinozist, which is something that I think she would have been quite keenly aware of, and so I think that's that would be one point that I would sort of hesitate to sort of think, well, yeah, maybe she would go more in that direction, but it doesn't seem likely to me. I come back to the question of what would it be possible for God to do? What's the most that God can do? When Conway is laying out her account of creation, and she's talking about the generation of Christ and how creatures came about, she lays out quite sort of carefully, within the bounds of possibility, what is the most that God could do. Yeah, I guess I have assumed with my argument that an infinite number of substances is more than an infinite number of modes in some sense. I mean, the reason why she limits Christ to one instance is because she sort of talks about why there's only one Christ, why there can only be one Christ, and so she takes it as then there might have been more than one Christ in some way. That's an open question. Could there have been more than one Christ? Oh, well, here's why there couldn't have been more than one Christ. But there is no analogous argument why there couldn't have been more than one creaturely substance. There isn't. I would expect a slightly different discussion there if she thought there was only one creaturely substance. Now I fully admit that this is just sort of more my feeling, more my gut instinct rather than actually strong sort of textual evidence. But I'm still pretty confident that my argument points more decisively in terms of an infinite number of substances rather than an infinite number of modes, due to simply the fact that Conway is very clear that God does as much as he can logically and within the bounds of without falling into contradiction, and that would seem quite clearly to me to be the creation of an infinite number of substances rather than an infinite number of modes. But that is just as much gut instinct at the moment as clear textual evidence, I think.
Sophia Calvente.
Hi, this is returning to your question about the oyster. I was wondering if maybe there is no punishment for the oyster because the oyster is not. Here's my daughter. Because the oyster is not endowed with free will, probably, or is it related to humans' free will or not? Punishment and rewards.
Yes, that's what I think, because She defines sin as ataxia, this disorderly direction of motion, or the power of moving from its appropriate place. How the oyster could move from its appropriate place, I think it's impossible. An oyster being another thing or doing something different of what this oyster does, I don't know. But even though it can go up or down, and we don't know why, that's the mysterious in these transmutations in the natural world. I think sin is only related to human nature.
Jonathan has a comment.
Yeah, just on that question, I would point out that the Conway in chapter 3, section 1, talks about all creatures having indifference of will. She says indifference of will is the basis for all mutability and corruptibility in creatures. So I don't know. It's not to say that really means that oysters definitely have a will as far as she is concerned. But it's just a sort of quite a suggestive thing that she says.
Well, I think it's this capacity of having a will or a knowledge or intelligence that all these this third substance is one and have all these capacities. But I think we cannot say that the sun has free will or intelligence. But eventually in this sequence of transmutation, it will get to a point that it will be an intelligent being. And I think there you can find this will, this indifference of will. This is my interpretation. Yes.
That's true. That's true also, say, for a stone. And the stone, yes. One thing that N. Conway says is, things can get worse and worse and worse, or less and less and less perfect, but they can never reach the state of pure matter.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes.
Because that would be inconsistent with divine goodness to create something that had no goodness in it, that was just bare matter. But so presumably, like the oyster, the stone could, by virtue of God's justice, without punishment, become more perfect.
Yes. Well, she has that example of the horse, and she says when the horse acts in a good manner, the best manner, this horse will ascend in this scale of being. And I think she's saying that this horse is following the orders of the owner of the horse, and that's the good behavior of the horse. If the horse goes against the will of the owner, maybe it ended dead. That's the punishment for the horse. I think it's different when we talk about human sin and the rest of the nature.
Well, but the thing is, at least with horses, you can say that there is a kind of sentience, a kind of intelligence.
Yes, yes.
You're talking with oysters.
Well, oysters.
Stones, not at all. I mean, what could pain or punishment mean to a stone?
Yes.
But, since at the moment we don't have any questions in the queue, so I would like to ask Jasper a question. And this has to do with a passage that I've always found interesting and puzzling in chapter 1, section 7. And this is the passage where he's talking about Trinity, the Trinity. And this is in the 1692 translation.
Okay.
where he says the phrase of three distinct persons, which is a stone of offense to Jews as well as Turks and other people, indeed itself has no sound reason, nor can be anywhere found in scripture. Yet all would easily agree on this point, et cetera, which is to say that she's offering an interpretation of the Trinity that would be acceptable to Jews and Muslims, as well as to Christians. And the implication is that there's a sense in which the idea of the Trinity is sufficiently universal that it is not limited in its significance to Christianity. And I've often wondered whether her, first of all, I find that the view a little bit puzzling what exactly it is that she means by that in this particular passage. But I've always wondered whether her acquaintance with Jewish Kabbalah may have in some way or another led her to that particular view.
Well, it's a long established view in Christianity, perhaps especially Augustinianism, but by no means limited to that, the view that the wisdom of God constitutes the special character of the second person, and the will or the love of God is what characterizes the third. And she's saying, I take it, that if, you know, everyone is going to acknowledge that there is wisdom and will or love in God, Jews and Turks can accept that. And all we need to give up is this hypostasization that these constitute three persons in one substance.
Which is a major problem for Jews and Muslims.
Yeah. Later on, and I can't remember exactly where in the book, but she says something like anyone who goes along with all this stuff about the word, or call him Adam Kadmon, whatever you want, or the Platonic mind, anyone who accepts that acknowledges Jesus Christ, even if they don't realize that that's what they're doing. So they're all really Christians deep down, just by accepting these Neoplatonic or Kabbalistic, or for that matter, Christian ideas. So likewise here, I think she is finding points that everyone would agree on in this instance, that God is a wise and loving being. And then getting rid of that stuff, which, as she says, is not in scripture, shouldn't ever have been part of Orthodox Christianity. And as long as we do that, then we can all agree.
So you don't see this as in any way reflection of some of her acquaintance with Jewish texts?
Not in any overt way. I mean, maybe it was reinforced by her acquaintance with Jewish texts, but I don't think one needs to have any particular acquaintance with Judaism or Kabbalah or anything like that to be saying this sort of thing. All that you need to know is that they don't endorse the Christian doctrine of the Holy Trinity in the terms in which it's defined in the Nicene Creed or wherever.
Great. Daria has a comment.
It was just a small reflection while you were speaking about oyster, because we have a discussion today with students on how we should establish the laws and rules for artificial intelligence. So there was an analogy between how we can think about responsibility and rules and laws in artificial intelligence and in animals, because we can educate both of them and so on. So it was just like a question, but in all this picture of and Conway, could we insert something like artificial intelligence and understand how we can treat this strange kind of entity?
Well, that's a wonderful thing to think about, but I think in this case, the artificial intelligence is created by man, by the women, by the human nature. So it's not created by God. And well, you can develop this intelligence as to be independent from the creator. I don't know. That's the problem for me in this case. But it's really interesting to think about this. Oh, obviously, and Conway was not thinking about this, but well, I will think about this. Yes, thank you very much.
Great. And if there are no further questions, I think we've come to an end. I think we should all unmute ourselves and clap for our speakers. Thank you very, very much. Next week, Claudia, what's on the
Experiment of Light with Doina, Alexandra, and Hannah.
Great. So next week, same time, same place. We look forward to seeing you all. Thank you very much for